And welcome back. Democracy Matters is a nonpartisan organization empowering students to take an active role in politics and social justice activism. From fighting voter suppression and expanding voting rights to tackling the influence of big money in politics, Democracy Matters is at the forefront of creating a more just and inclusive democracy. Join me now to tell us more is the executive director at Democracy Matters, Professor Joan Mandle, and thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So, in the wake of all that has gone on over the course of the last, I'll say 24, 48 hours, how do you relate?
It's really tough, and I'm sure anybody that's listening is feeling pretty gobsmacked at this point. I actually was very worried about this election in terms of Trump's winning, and kept trying to talk to people about how they should be prepared. My main message, and we can talk about that as we go forward, of course, is that the fight for social justice is never easy. It's never short. It goes on, and we will go on as well, protecting democracy, protecting the most vulnerable among us, and pushing back as well as we can against the damage that I'm very worried that Trump will do to our democracy.
Yeah, and I think that's on the minds of a lot of people. I think when you talk about Latinos, immigrants, the LGBTQ plus community, African Americans, as a matter of fact, the list goes on, right? That there's so many people who've taken exception with President-elect Trump to the place that now it's kind of like questionable as to the path forward, right? And how do you navigate that path forward? So in your conversation in spaces, what do you say to people about how to forge that path forward of fighting for democracy, given the fact that you know the president-elect's history and what's going on?
Yeah, well, I work with students, and both high school and college students. And one thing about young people is that they are usually pretty optimistic. And this has been, in a way, an exception to that because they've been very fearful of an election that would find Donald Trump as our next president. I think there are a few things that are takeaways that are positive. And as I said, one of the things is, I'm 80 years old. I've been active since the civil rights movement when I was in the South in 1964 with Freedom Summer. And I will continue, as long as I live, to continue the fight for social justice. But I think that one of the possible positive things that has come out of this is that half of the American people did not vote for Donald Trump and are very aware of the damage that he is able to do. It's no secret he is not a friend of democracy. He doesn't believe in democracy. He's said as much. The Republican Party has certainly acted as if they don't believe in democracy by trying to suppress the vote of anybody they can get a hold of, particularly African American poor people and students and senior citizens. So it's a very dangerous time right now. But I think that it's not. I mean, it looks like a landslide. It certainly was a terrible defeat for those of us, who believe in social justice and believe in democracy. But it's not as if the other people, those of us that wanted to see Kamala Harris as our president, are going to go away. We're not going away, and we will figure out how it is that we are going to try to, and what I think would be essentially limit his damage. He's going to do damage. There's no question about it. But we have to work together, all of us, as one. This is the most important time to build a coalition among all these groups that are against the threat that Donald Trump is to our democracy. We can't be divided up. And, we see that on college campuses where, the students that care about women's issues are in one group and environmental kids are in another group, and people who are worried about LGBTQ issues are in another group. We can't do that anymore. We need to understand that he is an existential threat to all our values, to all of the freedoms that we believe in, to all the rights that we have that he's already taken away. and we have to work together. We're going to go down together. It's
Right.
kind of as simple as that.
I want to talk from this perspective. Let's put the numbers out there. Um, about 8 million people live in New York City. That's the 5 boroughs. We got about 8 million people. When I look at yesterday's numbers, only 9 million people voted. What do we say about that? And when I say 9 million
Yeah,
people, I'm talking about 9 million people statewide. So we've
right,
got a huge issue.
right, right. Um, the American people in general are very cynical about and hostile to government. And one of the reasons that I think Trump won is that a lot of the people who feel that way voted for him. They don't really like the traditional Republican Party. They certainly don't like the Democratic Party. And this was just a sort of lashing out against government in general. And this government, this country's government, and this country's norms in particular. Um, so there are a lot of ways that those of us that believe in democracy have been working to try to make voting more accessible to everyone. The idea of getting early voting is pretty new in New York. We worked for it for a long time. That has helped more people get to the polls. We need to have same day voter registration, so you can just walk into the polls and say, I want to vote, I'm going to register now. This whole registration deadlines and having to go through this whole process with the registration forms is crazy. There's no reason for it. In fact, what we should have is automatic voter registration. If you're born in the United States, you are eligible to vote automatically. And I think that those kinds of barriers, structural barriers, have meant that lots of people just don't want to go through the process of voting, don't know how to go through the process of voting. So that's part of it. Part of it is that as a country, and in New York especially, we have been very recalcitrant in making voting easy for everybody. The second is, of course, that, as I said, the cynicism about government means that some people just don't want to have anything to do with it. And I haven't seen the data on young people's turnout yet, but they are always the lowest turnout. And of course, that should be a bellwether for everyone. If our young people don't believe in our democracy enough to participate, there's something really wrong. And so I think that the structural stuff is important. And I think that the cynicism and the fact that politicians are not speaking to a lot of the people that are staying home. Again, young people, again, low income people, and they just don't think it's theirs to participate. They don't think it makes any difference.
Yeah,
And
you
that's
know, you're tapping into something here because when you talk about the numbers of people that didn't show up to the polls yesterday, yes, that was I feel record numbers. When I look around, I say, yeah, 8 million people in New York City, but then when we look at the statewide, only 9 million people voted. We've got a huge gap here. But then I also look at the issues that matter the most, and we hear people talk about them on the daily. But as you hear people talk about these issues on the daily, it does not transcend into making its way into the booth to cast the vote. What is the barrier? Because, this is an exercise of democracy. You have the opportunity to exercise your right to vote. This is democracy in action. But yet and still we have so many people that say, I'm not going to participate in this no matter what. Either they're not trusting the candidate, or they're just not trusting the process, or they're just pretty much apathetic. I don't know how do you define it, but coming off the heels of this, I got a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think part of it is that we don't educate people in this country from the time they're in kindergarten that they're part of a democracy. They're part of a country that depends on them, and the government isn't something separate from them. The government is them. I mean, the notion that somehow, when you turn 18, you automatically get a conscience about participating in democracy, even though you don't know how, is really sort of ridiculous. I think we need to do a lot better job. What I've been advocating for years is having polling machines in middle schools, maybe even elementary schools, certainly high schools, let students go through the process of voting and show them that it's an easy thing to do, it's an important thing to do. Have classes and teachers that are teaching civics in a way that makes people feel that the government, as I said, is theirs. And I think that that would make it, certainly there's no silver bullet, but I think that would make a huge difference. I mean, I speak to students, we have chapters that really, schools where the students are really smart. And a lot of them say, well, I don't really know what to do when I walk into a voting booth. I mean, it's a scary process for a lot of young people. And I think we could make that a lot easier for everybody. Your basic question, though, is why people don't trust government. And I think they think that government isn't doing anything for them. And I think that politicians have to learn to speak more directly to what we call breakfast table issues. What people are eating, what people are doing in terms of the economy, how people feel safe or not safe in their neighborhoods, and not at the high level of, sort of abstract policy, but bringing it right down to the level of people's everyday lives.
Yeah, there's this. You got two things going on here. You got the economy. People say, listen, when you look at the numbers that are out there, the economic trends that are trending, they're showing that things are actually getting better. That's what
Exactly.
they're showing that things are getting better. But when you look at the vote yesterday, a lot of people in exit polls come out and say, the reason why I voted the way I voted was I have concerns about the economy. I was just having a conversation with a couple of people on our staff here prior to coming on, and I said, there is a difference between what is and how it translates to the life of the everyday person. So while these economic indicators can look good, and they look good, the person at home says, I don't see it because I'm still paying high prices for milk, travel, etc. And there is that disconnect. When we
Yeah.
look at that, how do we approach people in the area of really, I would say dealing with this, because there is that disconnect. But if you're ever going to have true democracy in action, you're going to have to bring both of those sides kind of like closer together in order to get to that landing point.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that the economy has gotten better. I mean, my husband's an economist, and he tells me this all the time. Inflation is down, uh, but people perceive it differently. Partially, they perceive it differently because people are bombarded by social media lies, frankly, that things are terrible. And even if it's okay for them, a lot of people feel, well, I'm okay, but it's a terrible situation out there. And I think that the Trump machine and the right has a very uh, clear message to people that things are terrible. And I think that you tell people, a big lie long enough and they start believing it. So I think a lot of it is this sort of constant drumbeat about how bad things are. The other thing I think is that people are traumatized by COVID and by what happened in COVID and after COVID. And there's no question that the economy took a terrible hit with COVID. We have done amazingly well given how bad it was. But there's still a sense that there is this uh, threat out there that everything can be taken away from me in a heartbeat. And I think psychologically, a lot of people, and I feel it myself, feel like, oh my gosh, around the next corner, is there going to be some major trauma that, like the one that we collectively as a society, as a world, went through during that COVID period.
Right. How do you view the future of democracy, given the fact that what we saw uh, in recent results?
Well, this was a fair election. It is true there was voter suppression. It is true the Republicans did everything they could to block people voting, but we lost. There were more, I mean, we even lost the popular vote, which I never thought we would do. There were more people that voted for Donald Trump. And we have to look at that and try to figure out whether that means that democracy is dead or it means that democracy worked. and we didn't get the outcome we wanted, and that's partly on us that we didn't do the kind of job of reaching out to those millions and millions of people and talking about our values and talking about social justice and why it should be important to them and not just to us, for example.
Right.
Uh,
And I said, getting up this morning, democracy worked. It was a fair election. Some people are not going to be are not going to be happy about the results, but the reality is, in most ways, it was a fair election, and we're not in the same throes as we were 4 years ago, or we're not talking about hanging chads anymore, right? We're
right.
in a place right now where we can honestly say democracy works. I think, sadly enough, a lot of people are not engaged in democracy
Right.
because they don't believe in democracy.
And our democracy was broken before this election.
Yeah, yeah,
If you have millions of votes that are suppressed, if you have former felons who can't vote, if you have $16 billion spent on this election, I mean, whose money is that? That is money of a tiny fraction of the American people, a tiny fraction of the American people who are essentially calling the shots of both parties. And I mean, there's just no denying that Kamala Harris raised tons of money. But most of those folks are very wealthy people and they have their own agenda. For example, the oil companies and the energy companies give to both Democrats and Republicans. And that explains, at least in part, why the United States has the terrible record on trying to deal with climate change, one of the worst of any democracy in the world. The fact that rich people are really have an enormous amount of influence on elections, it means that our democracy does not have what we were promised, which is one person, one vote. That if Elon Musk can spend millions of dollars on this election, he's got more political power than you have or I have. So the democracy is a flawed democracy. It always was. This election was fair. But one of the things that I think we need to work on is fixing those flaws so that we have what I call an inclusive or a participatory democracy, so that everybody feels that their vote and that they have is equal to everybody else's, and that everybody has a stake in the outcome. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. What's got me so angry is that I feel that my vote has been swamped by these billions of dollars of billionaires, multi-billionaires, who have influenced the election in a way that is simply not fair.
Well, we got to end this segment, but I'll tell you where I landed. I landed up, and especially in New York, when I thought about the numbers, I just feel like there are a lot of people, and that was nationwide, who've been given the right and chose not to exercise that right yesterday. And whatever outcome that we know it came about, it wasn't for the fact that people didn't have the opportunity. The opportunity just wasn't seized. And I think
Mm-hmm.
somewhere along the line, we've got to talk about getting from registration to activation, and then we can talk about how we can see democracy work. I love to see more people involved in the democratic process, but the reality is there's a lot of people been disenfranchised by the process. And so
Exactly.
therefore, because of which, I'm not going to be a part of this because I don't think it's going to work I don't think that it's going to work for me. We need to really go back, and if we're going to do this, do it right and do it in such a way that democracy can still win. It won yesterday because people did have the opportunity to vote freely and to vote fairly. But there's still more to that democracy definition that we have to unpack. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. And
and
I think there are a lot of people that recognize that. I mean, I know that my students are going to continue to do what they're doing, which is they're going to be holding conversations in their classes, holding conversations on campus, and talking about what went wrong from their point of view. What did we not do right? Or what structurally needs to change such that everybody has a fair voice and everybody uses that voice.
yeah, it's important. It's important for it to happen. All right, well, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much.
Okay.
You got to come back. I will do that because there's so much, and we had to unpack these results and all this other stuff. But we want to talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing at hand, too. And so you'll hear from our producers soon.
That's
Thank you so
great.
much.
Don't forget, there's a tomorrow, and the tomorrow is partially what you make it. So everybody has to sort of pull up their socks and decide what they want to do to help our country mend and heal.
That's it. Indeed, well spoken. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us.